Looks good. Okay. All right. Well, I guess there's a couple of Aggies around there, so howdy. But yeah, as Venu said, my name's Colt, and I guess I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Bitcoin, give you a little bit of history, it's pretty, kind of overview of, what it is, why it might matter to you or not, kind of where it came from, and maybe where it's going to go in the future. So if you have any questions, just let me know. It's kind of a pretty arcane topic, so I suspect that some of these things will kind of elicit a bunch of questions. So feel free to ask anything. So let's see. There we go. All right. So just a brief overview. Who I am. What is Bitcoin? Where did it come from? How might you go about acquiring Bitcoin? What does it mean to have Bitcoin or own it? Who uses it? Do like a little small SWOT analysis of of Bitcoin, and then some other topics as it relates to. There are other cryptocurrencies, but we're just going to focus on Bitcoin for today. So, and then kind of wrap it up with questions, and I have some backup slides too if anybody has some more deep dive technical questions. Those are ready to go as well. So as Venu mentioned, I'm a technical staff member at MIT Lincoln Laboratory, specifically in Group 59. So those of you unfamiliar with Lincoln Laboratory, we're a federally funded research and development center, FFRDC. What that means is that I don't work for any private companies. Our only customer is the U.S. government. We have a line item on the federal budget, but that's a very kind of small amount. It's kind of like similar to NPR is federally funded, but they only get like 5%. But yeah, so all of my customers tend to be either in the DoD or intelligence community. Specific to me, my group is Group 59, which is cyber system assessments, and our little blurb there is on the right. So we do, I do a lot of reverse engineering and vulnerability research on cyber systems, and so that's pretty generic and broad, but it can be everything from your home modem or router to an F-16. So pretty wide range of stuff that we look at. Obviously I'm a Bitcoin enthusiast. I was mining Bitcoin back in 2010 before it has become such a big phenomenon, I suppose, as it is today. With a couple of friends in San Antonio. I'm also a wine enthusiast. I'm currently finishing the WSET diploma level WSET stands for Wine and Spirit Education Trust. So it's essentially a trade degree on the topic of wine and stuff. So if any of you happen to be enophiles, we can chat about that later as well. And then, most importantly, so. Right. So what is Bitcoin? For those of you that may have never heard it or tried to ignore it, Bitcoin is considered to be the first cryptocurrency, and so it's a currency in the sense that it provides a feature that allows it to be securely transferred between users. And what's unique about Bitcoin is that it doesn't require a trusted third party, right? So what that means is, like, if you trust a third party, as an example, would be your bank. You log into your bank account, I want to send Venu money as a transfer there. I depend on the bank to kind of be the trusted third party to take the money out of my account and then give it to Venu's bank. And then, Venu's bank is really holding his money, right? So in that case, we actually have two trusted third parties. Venu has his bank and I have my bank. Bitcoin actually doesn't require that. So it's a trustless system between all the peers, and you can securely transfer things without necessarily needing to trust any of those other people that happen in between. So fundamentally, the security is provided by kind of several different clever uses of encryption. I'll try to stay away from some of the nitty gritty of the encryption, but if any of you guys have questions later about how the encryption is maybe used to protect certain parts of these features, I can go into it. So, and then finally, cryptocurrencies are largely associated with this concept called a blockchain, which we'll go into a little bit more later. And so transactions in Bitcoin, and fundamentally your proof of ownership, is recorded in this thing called a blockchain, which is similar to a database, just like how your bank might have a database that contains all of your bank account or your balance for your bank account. Bitcoin, what's unique about it is that everyone has a copy of the database, and nobody can really make edits nobody can forge edits to that database and trick other people into believing that there's a thing. So it's several different kind of very unique paradigms compared to the way that we kind of currently consider currency. So where did Bitcoin come from? So this is a little picture image to the right there. Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer cashless electronic cash system. And it was published by what is presumed to be a pseudonym for the author, Satoshi Nakamoto. And it was published in October 2008. And so it was, I say published, it was submitted to kind of a mailing list that is focused on cryptography. And so this paper lays out the concepts that we talked about so far in terms of defining this concept of a blockchain, using proof of work to secure transactions, and having that kind of like publicly distributed ledger. Yeah. All right. So so again, I kind of touched on a little bit of this. So what makes it different than normal currency? So again, the biggest thing is that there's no trusted third party for us to be able to securely transfer assets between each other. So the transactions are verifiable, and they're verifiable by everybody on the network, but forgeable by no one on the network except for the two people that hold those cryptographic keys that says that they own those Bitcoin. So it's not issued by a government, it's issued by an algorithm. And we'll talk a little bit about this later. The generation of Bitcoin happens via the concept called mining. And we'll get down in a second. Currently, Bitcoin is inherently deflationary. So I guess, especially following all these current economic times, I guess, the federal government's printing lots of money right now. Bitcoin actually has a cap. And it's defined by an algorithm. So there will only ever be 21 million Bitcoins ever produced on the network. And there's already people that have, when I say it's fundamentally deflationary because it has that ceiling, sometimes people lose their wallets or, so there are actually lost Bitcoin that will probably never be able to be spent again, right? So a fixed supply. And then, yeah, so anyone can participate on this network, right? So you can just download a piece of software, join the Bitcoin network, and your computer will receive that database I mentioned, and it will process transactions and validate whether or not they're like, good or bad. And so anyone can take part in it. And so this is just a closer look at that one little graph there to show. You can see at the bottom axis, we're starting from 2009 going up to 2041. This is the period of time in which Bitcoin will be generated, and you can see about 2040, that yellow line drops to zero. And what that yellow line represents is the reward that you get for mining a Bitcoin block, which is how Bitcoin are being mined. So you see it's kind of an inverse relationship between that yellow line, which is the mining reward, and the total supply of Bitcoin over time. So how would you go about acquiring Bitcoin, right? So one of those processes, as I just said, Bitcoin are kind of, the new Bitcoin are made via a process called mining. But mining serves two functions. So it's how mining both produces Bitcoin currently, at least until 2040, as I showed you on that graph. But it also is how transactions are recorded into that blockchain, into that distributed database that I mentioned before. So, so as a miner, you're trying to solve a very difficult cryptographic problem. That's probabilistically solvable, but you have to use a tremendous amount of compute power for it, right? So back when I was saying that, in 2010, when I was mining, I had, we had about like, $50,000 worth of computer equipment that was only dedicated to solving this cryptographic problem that we call mining, right? These days, it's actually transitioned to something even more eclectic. That top right image there seems to be a little box with a computer fan on it. And what that is a what's called an ASIC miner. It's application-specific integrated circuit. So it's actually processors people are making now. And those processors, the only purpose that they serve is to mine Bitcoin. You can't install Windows on these computers or whatever. They're very specific in terms of their what they're doing. To give you an idea of scale about how many people are mining Bitcoin and the type of resources that are being used for it, currently consumes about the approximate amount of energy as Switzerland, right? And so this is an estimate produced kind of, anyone can mine Bitcoin anywhere in the world. So this is, fairly rough estimate, but yeah, so it's it's quite a bit of energy being spent on this mining operation. So anyway, that's one way that you can acquire Bitcoin is via mining and the generation of new Bitcoin or the transaction fees therein. The other way is, definitely much easier, is that you can go to an online exchange and just purchase Bitcoin, right? So you can give, such as Coinbase, that you can create an account there, you can transfer them money, and then you can purchase Bitcoin from other, they're a market maker. So there are other people that have Bitcoin that want to sell it, and then there are people that want to buy it. So you can just essentially buy it through somebody else through one of these websites. There are also in-person exchanges. Depending on your city, you can maybe Google for it. But like in New York, every Friday or Saturday, there's a park where money changers will essentially set up tables, and you can go to a guy and hand him 20 bucks, and then he will transfer you 20 Bitcoins on the spot. And then here and there, I believe in Houston, when I looked up, there's maybe 10 or 12 of these. But there's also companies that have essentially built, Bitcoin ATMs, which is kind of the same process. You walk up to it, you insert your dollars, and then it shows you a little QR code, which you scan on your phone. And then, that is fundamentally the transfer of Bitcoin to you. So what does it mean to, have Bitcoin, or where are your Bitcoin, right? So, we've touched on this, that concept of cryptography several times, and your ownership of Bitcoin is expressed by you controlling the cryptographic keys for those particular Bitcoin. So, usually what this means is that there's always a computer involved in this case, right? So either it's your phone or your laptop, you have a thing called a wallet. And inside that wallet is a manifest of the cryptographic keys that allow you to control, the Bitcoin that belong to you on the network. So, if you happen to lose your keys, like let's say that you only had one copy of your Bitcoin wallet with your keys in it, it was on your phone, and you dropped your phone in the toilet, those Bitcoin are lost, right? There's no way to reverse transactions in the Bitcoin on the blockchain because it is so secure. So it's, in some sense, it's both a feature and a flaw, right? That there is kind of there's no way to revoke something that happens on the blockchain. It's once it's there, baby, it's there. As an example, in that fourth bullet, that's an example of Bitcoin address, and it seems, quite strange. It's using a special character encoding, but fundamentally, what that strange sequence of characters represents is the public address associated with your private key that allows you to control those Bitcoins. So if I wanted to send Venu Bitcoin, he would give me an address such as that. I would put it into my application, on my phone, and then would say, okay, send 1 Bitcoin to 3J98. Yada yada. Or your Bitcoins can exist in the exchange. So as I mentioned before, if you wanted to purchase Bitcoin, you go to Coinbase, then you can have a balance at the exchange. Your Bitcoiner is sitting there, but the important difference there is that those Bitcoin currently belong to keys maintained by the exchange, and then the exchange is showing you your balance. So it's always there's some risk associated with leaving your Bitcoin on an exchange. Specifically, and the one that actually affected me was that there have been several different hacks against exchanges where people lost Bitcoin because the exchange has the keys that control it. One example that affected me was an early exchange called Mt. Gox, where they essentially lost a bunch of Bitcoin, and at the time I had 24 Bitcoin in that exchange. And they're still kind of recovering assets, and they're going through bankruptcy or whatever essentially proceedings. But yeah, so 2 important distinctions: either you hold them in your wallet, or you put them in an exchange, and there's some trade-offs there. So how would you use Bitcoin if you happen to have it? So you again, it's a currency, right? So largely it just exists as a means of transferring value between individuals, right? So the act of being able to transfer it is kind of part of its value, right? The contents of a transaction, and this is the thing that gets put into that block in the blockchain, is the recipient address, as we talked about, just an expression of balance, how much you're sending, and a transaction fee, which is as you remember is a way that a miner can get Bitcoin themselves. So because they're trying to solve that really hard cryptographic problem that protects the blockchain, they're rewarded for their efforts, both in the generation of new Bitcoin and also for transaction fees. So, if you wanted to send, if you want your transaction to happen faster, you can pay a higher fee, and that provides a market incentive for a Bitcoin miner to put your transaction at the top of the list to make sure that it goes in the next block. Otherwise, maybe it takes a couple of blocks before it shows up in the network. So I've kind of, again, we've touched on blockchain a couple of times, and this is as part of being this distributed database that miners interact with, right? So, so the blockchain is fundamentally just a list of records, and they're associated with each other cryptographically, right? So unlike kind of modern databases, they might have, security measures that prevent other people from logging into the database, but they maybe don't necessarily use cryptography to protect the content at rest, right? So what's different about a blockchain is that every block that gets generated by one of these miners has a reference to the block that was generated previously. And that reference is expressed by a cryptographic hash or a one-way hash that is, as far as we know, or at least in terms of mathematics and compute power, is unforgeable, right? So this is kind of the heart of what I was saying before, that Bitcoin, you can't modify the history of the blockchain, otherwise people would be able to see it, right? You would never be able to reproduce, make a change to one of these transactions that say, hey, now Colt owns all the Bitcoin. You would never be able to reproduce a hash that other people wouldn't notice as being invalid. So the blockchain itself, everyone has a copy of it, and kind of has this kind of unmodifiable history. But this is that the little image representation at the bottom kind of shows you that you see the block contains the previous hash. The nonce is that field is important for how Bitcoins are mined. Essentially, the way that they solve the cryptographic problem is by just trying a bunch of random numbers and hashing the block to see if it matches something. And then a list of transactions that represent, kind of the current activity. As an example, that that transaction I mentioned that I wanted to send to Venu, it gets recorded there in that block. So who uses Bitcoin and why? So some people maybe they're interested in anonymity. So on the Bitcoin network, whenever you see a transaction, it's expressed only by those public keys that we saw before. It doesn't necessarily have my name, right? Those public keys you're also able to generate as many of those as you want. And so Bitcoin has what's kind of, I said anonymity here. I would actually say it's more accurately to call it pseudo-anonymous. So everyone knows that a certain address owns Bitcoin. That's kind of fundamental to how Bitcoin works, but they don't necessarily know that that address belongs to me, or like the previous case, Venu. Everyone can see that that address received Bitcoin, but somebody else would have to make the association that that address actually belonged to Venu. So people investing in speculation, Bitcoin's kind of gone through a wild ride, which is somewhat of the reason, why it's kind of gone in the popular media recently, just because it's kind of had this, price-wise, it's had a very meteoric rise over the last couple of years, and so that's somewhat novel. There are examples of governments using Bitcoin to circumvent sanctions. So as I mentioned before, there are no trusted third parties, and it turns out, the way that we impose sanctions on other countries is via trusted third parties, right? We depend on various banks across the world to say, hey, we don't necessarily want banking to work very well in this country or against this person. Turns out Bitcoin is really resilient to that, right? Anyone can participate, and it requires no trusted third parties, right? So countries that are under sanctions often have a kind of an incentive to look to Bitcoin to see how they can circumvent those things placed against them. And businesses, right? So one of the crazy things about Bitcoin is because anyone can participate, and the transaction fees are relatively low. One of the biggest transactions, $1 billion was moved across the planet in 10 minutes, and it cost them 68 cents. So as it relates to give an example, as what people normally spend in terms of GDP for credit card transactions and other things, which are again all means of electronic transfer of value. We spend something like 2 to 3% of our GDP or something, I think, on kind of like banking transactions, where I don't even know what the percentage is. 68 cents of the billion. Somebody can shout out the number. All right, so strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats of Bitcoin, right? So as I mentioned, pseudo and anonymity, right, is a strength for some people. You don't want people to know necessarily that you own a bunch of something, and it's cheap to move assets. And that there's no revocation, right? So there's no way for people to double spend or to back out of a transaction once it's happened. They can't reverse anything. For weaknesses, the energy consumption, as I mentioned, for mining, right? Like a lot of people are concerned with carbon footprint these days, and fundamentally, Bitcoin requires the use of a lot of energy for that mining operation. It's relatively complex and arcane, right? Again, I'm kind of talking to you about cryptography and public and private keys, and sometimes some of those things seem to be somewhat intimidating. And again, weakness may be no revocation, right? So in the case that it might be a feature for some, and not an anti-feature for others, right? So if somebody steals your Bitcoin, there really is no way for you to get it back. So the security of that blockchain is kind of maybe both a blessing and a curse. So opportunities, I think, perhaps a model for national currency, or at very least maybe, national currencies being expressed on a blockchain, and reducing, the cost of us to move money around, maybe getting rid of, credit cards as it relates just for the aspect of, electronically transferring money. And then, a potential appreciation of an asset. Again, as I mentioned before, Bitcoin is inherently deflationary. So, over a period of time, assuming that you believe that, Bitcoin has these value, that value is derived intrinsically from these features, then there's perhaps an opportunity for appreciation. So in terms of threats, regulation, again, as I mentioned, there are examples of countries like North Korea using Bitcoin to circumvent sanctions. And so, over the next, probably decade or so, we're probably going to see a lot of, reckoning, I guess, as it relates to how countries attempt to, address or interact, what might be considered a threat from these cryptocurrencies that are kind of, you might argue, would be fundamentally eroding our power to, impose sanctions against enemies. So again, a threat might be regulation, countries, outlawing it, or, imposing, maybe you can't generate your own keys anymore, and they want to know who owns, maybe they want to break the pseudo-anonymous part of it, right? Market manipulation, again, Bitcoin is definitely growing in terms of markets, but it can still be relatively thin in some of these exchanges. And so there's kind of if you could remember any kind of, past scam like Ponzi schemes and, wash trading and what have you, as it relates to all kind of, other assets and equities. Those are kind of re-happening again in this new market in some cases. There's not very much regulation, and there are still some seedy characters, but, maybe hopefully we'll catch up and we'll use reputable people. And then potential consolidation of mining power. And so one of the threats for that is that, one country ends up having all of the miners, and this is currently happening, is that essentially in China is where most of the miners exist. And if all of those miners got together and they are able to control more than, more than 50% of the global mining power, then there are some potential weaknesses as it relates to the blockchain. So you don't really want, you kind of want the mining power spread out across a bunch of entities. If there's only one person that controls all of the mining, well, then it's an issue, right? So there are other cryptocurrencies other than Bitcoin. One that I think is, perhaps most valuable, and is, I think, maybe in some sense kind of, Bitcoin version 2 is Ethereum. And the cool thing about Ethereum is that you can write what's called smart contracts. And so these are actually Ethereum smart contracts are essentially pieces of software that you publish to the blockchain, and then you can interact with them on the blockchain, and everyone has essentially a global distributed computer, if you will. And so there's a lot of really cool opportunities for, essentially to have that, that where the blockchain for Bitcoin only represents a store of value, in Ethereum, it represents a store of compute. And so that's kind of a really kind of cool way to go. Ethereum is also trying to push for a move from proof of work, which is proof of work as an example is that mining operation we're talking about that takes a lot of energy, to a proof of stake, where instead of needing to mine a bunch or use a bunch of data to solve that cryptographic puzzle, the proof of stake essentially is just that whoever has a lot of Ethereum, they get to make votes about things that happen, but they don't necessarily have to use a bunch of energy to accomplish the same thing. And then there's a new category called stable coins, and what these are tokens that are issued by an authority. So we've now lost the trusted third party thing, but they're still stored on a blockchain. But the tokens are created by a third party and presumably backed by some other physical asset. So the two listed there, Tether and USDC. You might have also heard some news recently about Facebook wanting to start a cryptocurrency. And those are largely all examples of what I'd call stable coins. And so those are tokens that are issued by that trusted third party. And then they kind of make a promise that says, hey, yes, in a bank account I have, in the case of Tether and USDC, these are both dollar-backed stable coins, that they own that number of dollars in the bank account somewhere. So, but you have, again, a point being in there in the stable coins, you kind of lost a lot of the other features as it relates to that no trusted third party part. So if you wanted to own cryptocurrency right now, it's probably easiest for you to choose I would suggest that you choose a US based exchange. There are some that are in Hong Kong and other jurisdictions and stuff, but I mean you'll have the most protection, I think, if you stay on our turf. As I mentioned before, regulation is still catching up, and some of the foreign exchanges they attempt to avoid, some of the rules that we impose, like so AML and KYC, or anti-money laundering and know your customer, right? So some of these exchanges allow anybody to kind of sign up for on them, and they kind of will end up being breeding grounds eventually of money laundering. But the U.S. based exchanges typically operate above board like that. So Coinbase is a good example. I believe they're based in California and New York, and they're more like a traditional bank account. They have approval by the SEC and various bodies in the United States to operate, and they're a good operation. So, and then just kind of a quick reminder again: if you do purchase Bitcoin from an exchange, if you leave them in the exchange, just remember that you're not necessarily in the control of them. You can have more control if you were to transfer them to a wallet that you own privately. As an example before, in my case at Mt. Gox, my Bitcoin were stored on the exchange, and then they went bankrupt, and so I lost those Bitcoins. Right? There's no way for me to get anything or get them back. Right? So, all right, everybody still awake? Any questions?
Okay, so what do you do with the Bitcoin? So is it just as an investment thing, or is it something you can do with?
Yeah, so Bitcoin is pretty much only really valuable in the sense of a transfer of value. So it's like, what can you do with a dollar bill, right? You find other people that are willing to accept a dollar bill for goods and services, and for Bitcoin, you find other people that are willing to accept Bitcoin for goods and services.
I guess you can also use it as an investment thing, so hoping it will go up in value.
Yeah, for sure. Like I said, there's I might even have I could switch to one of my tabs here in a second, but yeah. So I mean, historically, right? Bitcoin starting on 2010 to now, it's ranged wildly in price from when I got started around $36 per Bitcoin to at its peak maybe a year or two ago to $20,000 a Bitcoin, and I think today it's around 11,000. So there has been kind of a wild amount of appreciation in Bitcoin, both due to interest and speculation and all that kind of stuff. So it's hard to say. It's hard to say whether or not it'll continue to appreciate in value over a period of time. But as it relates to if you believe kind of maybe that it does have intrinsic value, the fact that it's deflationary might almost make an argument that it will appreciate over time. But again, that's maybe your group has some economists that can tell me better. But yeah.
So how many?
This is Miguel from Argentina. I live in a country that has, I don't know, 50 to 60% inflation, devaluation of currency per year. And that's mostly because I think of lack of trust in a currency. What is there anything about Bitcoin? Because I still don't understand this side of it. Is there anything about Bitcoin that inherently, technically, would be a bulwark against lack of confidence in the Bitcoin currency and prevent it from going to, say, a value of 5 cents?
Sure. So I think that's a tricky one in the sense of and it kind of I think maybe I'll rephrase that question perhaps is that is Bitcoin a good store of value?
Right.
So a lot of people will look at physical assets like owning gold or silver, right? You kind of gold and silver bugs see owning that physical asset as a way to preserve and store value over a long period of time, and maybe not ever necessarily appreciate, right? Just avoid, as you were saying, inflation in a currency, right? And Bitcoin does have a lot of characteristics that are pretty similar to some of those physical assets. There's only going to be a limited supply of it. That's kind of similar to gold too, at least as far as we understand, right? There's only so much we're ever going to be able to pull out of the ground. As it stands right now, I would say that Bitcoin maybe it's probably not as good of a store of value as gold is, just because it has experienced such wild fluctuations in value. Even though overall that average has been the uptrend, I would still say that, something that's so volatile is also hard to kind of argue as being a really good, store of value if it can swing so wildly. But yeah, hopefully I answered part of your question. As it relates to trusting it, yeah. So but the way that Bitcoin works in terms of the miners are, they're the ones that generate those blocks. And as it stands so far, the miners are kind of all over the world. The only way that the trust breaks down in Bitcoin is that if if kind of one party or a bunch of colluding parties end up owning more than 50% of the mining power, and so far, that seems to be largely infeasible at this point as the network continues to grow and more miners come online. The concept that somebody else would be able to aggregate all that power seems really unlikely. And so in that regard, because it's so distributed, you might actually consider it to be, more trustworthy in that regard, right? That there isn't just one authority that gets to say, okay, well, I'm going to issue a bunch of new Bitcoin right now, right? That's not possible in the Bitcoin system. You have to get consensus, that it has to go through consensus. Everyone, if you want to make a change to the Bitcoin protocol, you have to get over 50% of all the miners to switch to that new software. Otherwise, it just doesn't exist. Right?
I have a question. I have a question on Coinbase. They created wallets. Are they safe? Like I know that if you're on the exchange, like you said, you lost your money. Mm-hmm. Or the coins or whatever it was.
Yeah.
But if the wallet is attached to Coinbase, is that the same thing as when you got ripped off?
Yeah. So I think for Coinbase, they actually have kind of two sides of it. At the time, Mt. Gox didn't have a phone application, but I believe Coinbase, there's just two aspects. So when your coins are in Coinbase, they're the ones maintaining your keys for you. And so, like as I mentioned, there is a little bit of risk there. But I do believe that the Coinbase, the application that you can run on your phone, I believe it can generate Bitcoin addresses that you can then transfer your balance from the keys that the exchange owns to the keys that exist only on your phone or your, or if you installed, or on your desktop computer, if you ran the Bitcoin client, you can generate keys there, right? So,
it's so confusing, with the wallet and all those codes and how it goes, and then you get one of those little imprints. I forget what they're called. One of these little UPS. What are they? Those
QR code.
Yeah, that code, and it's really, it's just so confusing, because like all those recently, all those I think ball players lost all their money.
I'm not familiar with that story, but yeah, I can believe it.
I mean, there was like $40 million. They said that they lost. They had bought it a long time ago, but nobody could remember the passcode. I mean, it's really crazy.
Yeah, like I said, I mean, and I listed that under one of the weaknesses, right? Is that, I agree that it's complex. It's kind of, a new thing, and is, you can, you have to be careful because you can make mistakes, because if you make a mistake, it's unrevocable, right? Or you can't call your bank and ask them to undo something. It's there forever. It's done.
I mean, it's just really, from way back in the beginning when it was all like, 2 years ago, it was already moving.
Mm-hmm.
I watched like 8 videos on how to use your wallet, and I just didn't get it. I just did not get it. So Coinbase made it really easy, but but they kept saying don't leave it on the exchange.
Right.
But they do move it to somewhere, what they call your wallet. But I didn't know if it was really a wallet, like Jax or one of the other things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like I said, I haven't really looked into the full details of Coinbase's like application that you would run, say, on your phone to see whether or not it will do it's the Coinbase app, but you could still, those keys could exist only on your phone or only in the exchange. And I don't know on their application how that works. I thought that you could generate your keys on your phone, and then they would transfer them to those keys, and then they would be technically off the exchange and only on your phone. But I'd have to look more into that.
Well, for anybody that's interested, Coinbase is for morons. It's a lot easier than all this other stuff. So unless, I really don't know if I could ever get at the stuff I did. I mean, I don't know. But anyway.
Colt, I got questions.
Joe T's got a question.
How does the income tax fit into all this?
Yeah.
It sounds like this is kind of under the table.
Yeah. So when I moved to Boston, I actually paid for part of my house in Bitcoin, and I got a tax guy the first year they were here, and he was super excited. He was like, "I've been waiting for somebody to come in with the Bitcoin sales thing." So the current guidance from the IRS is that it counts as a physical asset. So In my case, where I was mining Bitcoin, my cost basis for that asset was, what I spent on the mining operation itself, right? So I mentioned before we had a bunch of computer equipment that we bought, right? And then we also had really high electricity bills, as we mined it. And so I used those numbers to calculate, what it cost me to produce those Bitcoin. And then what I paid in terms of taxes was what, when I sold them. In my case, because I held the asset for longer than a year, it counted as a qualified or a long-term investment. And so the tax rate was about 12 or 15% or something, if I remember correctly. But you are right. So there is, as it relates to some people maybe attempting to avoid taxation on this stuff, especially if you're using kind of one of these unreputable exchanges, they may not necessarily report any gains that you have from the trade of cryptocurrency. They may not report it to the IRS, and it's incumbent on you to do so. If any of you happen to use TurboTax this year and the last couple of years, you might have actually seen a question that asked, did you buy or sell any cryptocurrency in this last year? And it's because the IRS is beginning to turn more of an eye towards people profiting and not paying tax.
Sounds kind of like an offshore account.
Sure. Like I said, the thing is that, if you purchase Bitcoin and always keep it as Bitcoin and you never sell it back into, fiat currency anywhere, you probably still are supposed to record your taxes, but it's definitely a lot less likely to generate a paper trail. The case where the IRS is pursuing people, it's largely because, they're, buying Bitcoin, selling it on an exchange to, US dollars. And, that's a very, obvious transaction as far as the IRS is concerned, because they can, ask Coinbase to be like, hey, like, who sold Bitcoin and then where did they transfer it to in terms of bank accounts, and they can come after you. But you're right. If it's in terms of, your offshore account thing, again, we mentioned that one of the features is pseudo anonymity. If I buy Bitcoin from a guy on the street, or a Bitcoin ATM, and then, I decide to buy Venu's car, with Bitcoin, well, cars maybe a bad example, a refrigerator from him that he has with Bitcoin. And, there's really not much of a record of transaction there other than, Venu received Bitcoin from some address no one's ever seen before. So, like I said, so there's the regulatory component I was listing in terms of, threats. That's kind of one of the reasons, right? And to scale it up, that example is that North Korea was using it to circumvent sanctions. So, you can definitely see that there's some value there to some people. So.
I think Jorge had a question too.
Yes. I work for a nonprofit, and I've been getting weekly emails all of a sudden from industry publications, and they're encouraging nonprofits to accept donations in Bitcoins. Mm-hmm. As really as a way to connect with younger donors. And
sure.
How would one go about doing that? I mean, how do we change, let's say we get a transaction in, how do we spend it?
Yeah. So for you, I would recommend going to Coinbase. Coinbase might even have a way for your organization to sign up as a not-for-profit and have an account with them. And what you would do is you sign up for an account, you would produce, they will, say that you operate in Bitcoin, and they will give you, your public Bitcoin address, and then you can use that. You put that address on your your emails or your web page or whatever, and or Twitter, whatever happens, and say like, hey, if you want to donate to us, send money to this address, and from whatever platform that they're using, they send money to it. It'll show up in your Coinbase account. At which point on Coinbase, you guys can use, because Coinbase is an exchange. You can then, exchange the Bitcoin that those people sent you for US dollars and then transfer it out of Coinbase, and you have cash.
Thanks.
Sure.
I believe Steve Blair had a question.
More questions. One of them is in relation to mining. As the number of miners increases, does the difficulty in mining Bitcoin increase also? And the second part is, as you solve these algorithms and mine the Bitcoin, is all that effort, is Bitcoin itself getting the benefit of the solving these algorithms? Is it improving the security around it, or how does that work?
Yeah, that's a super great question, Steve. Yeah, so the way that the algorithm works is your first question was, does it get more difficult? And the answer is yes, right? And so the way that this works and how it gets more difficult over a period of time as more miners come on, and this is actually one of the reasons why I quit mining, is because it became so difficult. The amount of hardware that I needed to continue to mine and be profitable, was sinking because people were using those ASICs and I didn't have those ASICs, right? Yeah, so the way that the algorithm works is that it wants to maintain a block being solved every 10 minutes, okay? And so over a 24-hour period, it wants, 24, by 6 or whatever number of blocks being solved. And the algorithm makes this, consensus decision for everyone's software makes the same decision at the same time. So what happens is let's say in a 24-hour period, somebody, turns on a bunch of new miners, right? And the difficulty level is currently set, at a certain level, and you turn on new miners, and what will happen is that there will be more blocks solved. It'll be faster than 10 minutes, okay? So what will happen is, like, let's say that it gets down to 9 minutes, right? So it's like, okay, well now all these people that are doing mining, we're seeing somebody solve one of these blocks every 9 minutes. So what will happen is that after a 24-hour period, the algorithm will say, hey, the rate is too fast. And what it will do is it will increase the difficulty level. And so it'll adjust to the amount of hashing power that exists in the network at any given time. And it's usually windowed by that 24-hour period.
So then as these things get solved, I mean, is it, what kind of algorithms are they solving for, and who gets the benefit of that?
Yeah, so let me see. Yeah, so what they're solving is, I guess I don't talk about it too much detail here, but the algorithm that they're solving when they're mining a block is SHA-256. So this is a FIPS approved algorithm. It's used for, ensuring that the integrity of a message is correct. And what's unique about so this is, this is a quick example to show you like what these hashes mean, right? So for a small change in input, the value produced, from the input side to the digest side changes by a lot. So a small change on the input produces a large change in the output. But what the miners are trying to do is that they take those blocks, the contents of all the transactions, the nonce, the difficulty level, and the hash of the previous block. And then what they do is that they change that nonce value repeatedly and then hash the whole thing, right? They're producing a SHA-256 hash, that whole thing. What they're looking for is what's called, it was essentially a collision, but the difficulty level weakens that security guarantee. And so they're trying to find a hash for that block that has a certain number of leading zeros, okay? So every time they make a change to the nonce, and so this is what the process, they have their transactions, they have the hash of the previous block, they make a change to the nonce, they hash the whole thing, and they get a value. Does it match the criteria for the current difficulty level, yes or no? If no, we change the nonce again, we rehash the whole thing, we make a check. And so they do that at incredible speeds, right? These ASICs, we're talking like what they call like peta hashes, right? There's, huge amounts of compute that's being thrown at this problem. But fundamentally, all they're doing is they're changing that little nonce value and trying to hash the whole thing and see if that kind of non-deterministic hash value matches, the criteria set forth by like the current level of difficulty. Does that make sense? That's a pretty arcane portion of the mining stuff. I was hoping to, hopefully I did it justice, but.
No, I think I kind of get it. I had to think about it for a while, but I appreciate it. That was good.
Yeah. So, and the reason is that because they weakened the guarantee of that of that hashing algorithm by saying you don't have to collide the whole value. You just need to have the first couple of bits be zeros. Based on you can essentially kind of calculate a probability based on the number of, assuming all things are equal. You can essentially determine what the probability of success is, right? And so that's why it's a probabilistic difficulty level, right? So when they adjust the difficulty level, they make it harder. It means you have to have more zeros in the front, And if it becomes easier, you need less zeros. And so as you adjust the number of zeros that you need, it then makes it more or less probable that you'll at any given hash find a collision that solves the block, right? But
Okay.
yeah, fundamentally that's the cryptographic problem that they're doing is SHA-256 that's weakened based on the current difficulty level.
Thank you.
Venu, can you see any other questions that are pending?
Let's see, there was one question about earlier. Let's see.
I think Grace Yee had a question.
Yeah, exactly. I'm trying to see if I can find it.
Wait, I'm sorry, I guess I could check chat.
Yeah, she asked if Dogecoin is a type of cryptocurrency. What's a Dogecoin?
I think, I mean, I think it started out as like a joke, but I thought that it might, you know, since I was late on the Bitcoin and I didn't get that profit, I actually did put some money in the Dogecoin, but it was a mistake. So I just wanted to ask about those type of, you know, cryptocurrencies, you know, there's different types and what that's about.
So, you know, that's a great question. Yeah, so Dogecoin was a little bit of a joke in the early days of Bitcoin. It was, again, because it's this distributed system and anyone can take part of it. Somebody started their own, like they essentially cloned Bitcoin and started their own new blockchain, right? So it wasn't like on the Bitcoin blockchain. They just like, you know, took the open source software and started a new root for their blockchain, right? And they called it Dogecoin, and you know, there's the Doge meme or whatever at that period of time, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, Dogecoin has continued to exist. I mean, as kind of, you know, a thing, just some software that, you know, some people are still running out there. I think it still does have some value. I don't know what it's currently at. I'm at maybe a couple of cents or something. Let me see. Let me exit the screen share. Am I still sharing or stop share? Okay, there we go. Yeah, so I think it's possible that Dogecoin might still have some value. I haven't looked to see. I guess I check Coinbase, but yeah, it was just a derivative of Bitcoin, but it was never, you know, meant to be serious kind of thing, and didn't have that, like, you know, that the transaction history that Bitcoin had. You know, that slide that I had with all the kind of other cryptocurrencies and the different types. I only kind of mentioned Ethereum as an example of, you know, a decentralized cryptocurrency that I think is technically interesting. But there are, I mean, there's probably hundreds of cryptocurrencies that various people have attempted to start now that have, you know, maybe slightly different, you know, intrinsic things that they're trying to accomplish with it. Another one is called Zcash, and in that case, that one actually has better anonymity guarantees than Bitcoin does. It's not pseudo-anonymous, it's more truly anonymous. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of people that are kind of, you know, because of the success of Bitcoin, right? Some people have kind of taken that and run in various different directions. But like I said, I think the future for the next 10 years, I think smart contracts, as Ethereum being an example of a platform that allows the creation of smart contracts. I think you'll see a lot of interesting, you know, fintech stuff come out of that. But yeah, I think already lost money on Dogecoin. That's a bummer.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's the blockchain concept in general is interesting far beyond economics, because it's an immutable record of every transaction that happens with a thing, no matter what that thing is. And so I think I'm already seeing at Salesforce it being developed to be integrated to commerce platforms in general. But from a contract perspective, it's got a lot of interesting uses. Yeah,
like I said, it's, you know, that's, you know, like the, you know, Bitcoin and blockchains in general, you know, because Bitcoin was kind of the first and got so closely associated with it. But yeah, the concept of having like a distributed database that's, you know, not possible for anybody to ever hack, and they can't hack all of them all at once. And even if they did, you know, you can't reproduce those hash values because it's so computationally infeasible to do so. Definitely has a lot of, you know, interesting applications for things other than just a simple token that you transfer back and forth. But
right, like a title, like you get an accurate record of every owner on a title that can't be modified or erased. That'd be super.
Oh, I'm fascinated by people losing the Bitcoin. How much do we actually know how much is out there? How much is lost?
How much is lost? No, but I mean, that's a good question. I don't know, but there's you can definitely find like crazy stories. Like I might even had a slide in it somewhere, but there's a guy that was I think in Canada that he had a hard drive with like tens of thousands of Bitcoin on it, and he threw away the computer at some point before the Bitcoin was like worth $20,000 of Bitcoin, right? So in some landfill, right, and in some country, there's like $50 million worth of Bitcoin on a hard drive, just buried under a bunch of trash, right? So you treasure seekers out there, maybe it's worth it to go buy a dump in Canada and then just excavate the whole damn thing. I don't know. It's
How much was yours worth? What you lost?
at its peak, it would have been from what I lost at Mount Gox. Yeah, at its peak, it would have been worth $480,000. Right now, it only be about 260, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Wow.
Yeah. Yeah. Sadly, I actually have an offer from a private equity firm called Fortress Capital. They're willing to buy out my stake in the Mount Gox bankruptcy claim. They think that they're going to recover maybe like 12% of what was originally there. So it's like, I'm probably going to get back like 3 Bitcoin from the 24 kind of thing. They're actually, but the point being is there are actually people that are willing to buy my claim against that Bitcoin as part of the bankruptcy proceedings, which is weird.
All right, Bill.
Thank you so much, Colt, for that fascinating program.